story of the United States military is not just a chronicle of battles, it is the evolution of a global titan. To understand the modern world, one must understand how a nation that once avoided foreign entanglements transformed into the most powerful force in human history. This journey begins in the smoke of the early 20th century, a time when empires were crumbling and the map of the world was being redrawn in blood. Before 1917, the United States was largely an observer of global chaos, protected by two vast oceans and a policy of isolationism. But the Great War in Europe changed everything. When American doughboys arrived on the Western Front, they brought with them a fresh industrial energy that tipped the scales of history. This was the first time the world witnessed the arsenal of democracy in action, a glimpse of a sleeping giant that was just beginning to wake up. However, the true birth of the American superpower occurred on a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii. December 7, 1941 remains a date which lives in infamy. The Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was intended to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and force a surrender. Instead, it ignited a fire that would consume the Axis powers. Within months, the American economy underwent a metamorphosis that defied logic. Car manufacturers shifted overnight to producing thousands of B-24 Liberator bombers. Appliance factories began churning out machine guns. This was the era of total war, where the factory floor was just as vital as the front line. The United States wasn't just fighting with soldiers, it was fighting with an overwhelming tide of steel, oil, and technology. From the beaches of Normandy to the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, the American military displayed a capacity for logistical miracles that the world had never seen. As World War II reached its climax, the United States unveiled a secret that would forever change the nature of existence: the Manhattan Project. The successful detonation of the atomic bomb in the deserts of New Mexico marked the end of conventional warfare and the beginning of the nuclear age. When the mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the war ended, but a new, more terrifying era took its place. The United States emerged from the ruins of 1945 as the only nation on Earth with a bomb and a fully intact industrial base. It was no longer just a participant in global affairs, it was the architect of a new world order. The dollar became the global currency, and American bases began to dot the map from Germany to Japan. The eagle had spread its wings, and it was never going back to its nest. But this new dominance came with a shadow. The Soviet Union, once an ally against Hitler, now stood as a formidable rival with its own nuclear ambitions. The world was split into two ideological camps: capitalism versus communism. This was the birth of the Cold War, a struggle that would define American life for the next 40 years. It was a war of nerves, played out through high-stakes espionage, proxy conflicts, and a frantic race to reach the stars. The creation of the CIA and the National Security Council meant that for the first time, America was in a state of permanent mobilization. The military-industrial complex warned of by President Eisenhower was beginning to take root, weaving the needs of the military into the very fabric of the American economy. By the early 1950s, the Cold War turned hot in the mountains of Korea. This forgotten war was a brutal reality check. It proved that even with atomic weapons, the US would still have to fight grueling, conventional battles to contain the spread of Soviet influence. The American soldier was now a global policeman, stationed in frozen trenches far from home to defend a line on a map. This period solidified the concept of containment, the idea that American power must be used to block communism wherever it appeared. As the 1950s gave way to the 60s, the United States stood at its zenith. It was a land of booming suburbs, space-age technology, and undisputed military might. Yet, beneath the surface of this golden age, the seeds of future conflict were being sown in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The American spirit was confident, perhaps overconfident, as it prepared to face an enemy it did not yet understand. Part 1 ends here, with a nation at the peak of its power, unaware that its greatest trial was waiting in the shadows of Vietnam. Transition from the triumphant heights of the 1950s to the humid, blood-stained jungles of the 1960s remains the most jarring chapter in the American story. As the Cold War intensified, the United States found itself drawn into a conflict that would challenge its moral authority and military prestige: Vietnam. This was not a war of clear front lines or massive tank battles. It was a war of shadows, whispers, and endurance. When American combat troops first landed in Da Nang in 1965, the prevailing belief in Washington was that the sheer weight of American technology and industrial might would bring the North Vietnamese to their knees within months. They possessed the world's most advanced fighter jets, napalm, and a seemingly endless supply of resources, but the jungle had other plans. The enemy, the Viet Cong, practiced a brand of guerrilla warfare that nullified every traditional advantage the US military possessed. They lived in an intricate, miles-long network of underground tunnels, appearing from the earth to strike and then vanishing before a counterattack could be launched. American soldiers, often just teenagers drafted from small towns across the Midwest, found themselves in a green hell where every step could trigger a lethal booby trap. The humidity was suffocating, the leeches were constant, and the psychological toll of fighting an invisible enemy began to erode the foundations of the American fighting spirit. To counter this, the US launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign that dropped more ordnance on Vietnam than was used in all of World War II. Yet, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the lifeline of the North, remained open, hidden under a canopy of trees that even the most powerful explosives couldn't fully clear. As the war dragged on, the battlefield expanded from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the living rooms of America. Vietnam was the first television war. For the first time in history, the visceral reality of combat was broadcast into every home during dinner time. The American public watched as their sons returned in flag-draped coffins and as the horrors of war were laid bare without the filter of government censorship. This sparked a domestic revolution. The anti-war movement grew from small campus protests into a national roar that fractured the country along generational and political lines. The 1968 Tet Offensive served as the ultimate turning point. While militarily a failure for the North, it was a psychological masterstroke. It proved to the American people that despite the government's promises of light at the end of the tunnel, the enemy was far from defeated. By the early 1970s, the goal of the United States had shifted from victory to peace with honor. The process of Vietnamization, handing over the war to the South Vietnamese, was an attempt to exit a quagmire that had already claimed over 58,000 American lives. Final images of the war, showing helicopters evacuated from the roof of the US Embassy in Saigon in 1975, became a haunting symbol of a superpower in retreat. It was a moment of profound national soul-searching. The Vietnam Syndrome took hold, a deep-seated reluctance to engage in foreign conflicts that would dictate American foreign policy for the next 2 decades. The military-industrial complex was forced to modernize, moving away from the draft and toward an all-volunteer force that was more professional, more specialized, and more reliant on the next generation of high-tech weaponry. The legacy of Vietnam was a bitter pill for a nation that had become accustomed to winning. It taught the Pentagon that technology alone cannot defeat a determined grassroots insurgency. However, out of this defeat, a new American military philosophy was born. The US began to focus on airland battle doctrines and the development of smart weapons, GPS-guided bombs and stealth technology designed to ensure that if America ever went to war again, it would be on its own terms, swift, overwhelming, and precise. The Eagle had been wounded, but it was spending the 1980s sharpening its talons for a new kind of confrontation. As the Cold War entered its final act, the stage was set for the desert sands of the Middle East, where the American war machine would seek to redeem its reputation and prove once again that it was the undisputed master of the modern. The 1980s and 90s saw a massive rebuilding of the American military, but everything changed on a crisp Tuesday morning in September 2001. The fall of the Berlin Wall had signaled the end of the Cold War, leaving the United States as the world's sole remaining superpower, a period often called the unipolar moment. The American military had proved its absolute dominance in the 1991 Gulf War, where a massive coalition led by US forces liberated Kuwait in just 100 hours using revolutionary GPS-guided smart bombs and stealth aircraft. For a decade, it seemed that conventional war was a relic of the past. But the events of 9/11 shattered that illusion, forcing the Eagle to turn its gaze away from traditional nation-states and toward a new, decentralized enemy, global terrorism. The war on terror began in the rugged, unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan. Operation Enduring Freedom was unlike any conflict in history. It featured a surreal blend of old world and high-tech warfare, where Special Forces operators rode horses alongside Northern Alliance tribesmen while using satellite uplinks to call in precision strikes from bombers flying miles above the clouds. The swift collapse of the Taliban regime reinforced the belief that American power was invincible. However, the mission soon shifted from a retaliatory strike into a complex, decades-long project of nation-building. The US military found itself trying to plant the seeds of democracy in a land that had resisted foreign conquerors for centuries, leading to a grueling counterinsurgency that would become America's longest war. In 2003, the focus shifted even further into the heart of the Middle East with the invasion of Iraq. Under the banner of shock and awe, the US launched a massive air campaign designed to paralyze the Iraqi command structure. Baghdad fell in less than a month, and the world watched as a statue of Saddam Hussein was toppled in Ferdo Square. But the victory was short-lived. As the formal military crumbled, a chaotic insurgency rose to fill the vacuum. The streets of cities like Fallujah and Ramadi became the new front lines of the American experience. This was the era of the WWII, improvised explosive devices, primitive but deadly roadside bombs that became the leading cause of casualties. American soldiers had to adapt to a world where any trash can, parked car, or loose brick could be a lethal trap, and where the enemy wore no uniform. During this period, the nature of warfare underwent a technological revolution. The sky above Iraq and Afghanistan became crowded with the hum of MQ-1 Predator drones. For the first time, pilots sitting in air-conditioned trailers in Nevada could conduct surveillance and launch Hellfire missiles on the other side of the globe. This was the birth of the remote war, a clinical and detached method of combat that allowed for the targeted elimination of high-value targets, including the decade-long hunt for Osama bin Laden. While these tools offered surgical precision, they also raised deep ethical questions about the transparency and accountability of modern warfare. The forever wars were becoming a permanent part of the American landscape, draining trillions of dollars and pushing the all-volunteer force to its absolute limit. By the time the mid-2010s arrived, the American public was exhausted by endless intervention. The rise of ISIS in the wake of the US withdrawal from Iraq forced a reluctant return to the region, highlighting the whack-a-mole nature of fighting decentralized extremist ideologies. The shadow of the eagle was now cast over a world that felt more unstable than ever. The lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan were painful and complex, echoing the scars of Vietnam. As the 21st century progressed, it became clear that the era of massive, boots-on-the-ground occupations was coming to an end. The American military was preparing for its next evolution, a shift away from desert insurgencies and toward the digital and orbital frontiers. The stage was being set for a new kind of conflict, one fought not with tanks but with code, and not for land but for the future of global information.